Good afternoon, everyone. Thank you so much for joining us today for IPDay's Webinar Wednesday. Today, we're going to be talking about the new adult education standards. You're going to be able to see how to access those new standards and get an understanding of the structure and the underlying principles of the new standards. Facilitating our webinar today are Molly and Shira from Bloomboard. So we're really looking forward to hearing from them and looking over the frameworks and digging a little bit deeper into it. Before we get started, I will remind you of some housekeeping reminders. Remember that your microphones are muted and you are in listen-only mode. Today's presentation, like all IPDay's presentations, are recorded and they will be archived and available on the IPDay website within 48 hours. If you have a question, you can enter it into the Q&A option that is on your screen there. So we hope you enjoyed the webinar today and you are engaged and ask lots of questions, and I'll turn it over to Molly and Shira. Thank you, Molly and Shira.
Thanks, June. My name is Molly, and my colleague who's here with me today is Shira. We are both former classroom teachers, deep instructional nerds who have a love of standards frameworks because they really provide the blueprint or the roadmap for how instruction looks in the classroom. And just to tell you a little bit about myself and Shira, I'm a former secondary math teacher. Shira has a deep love of literacy, having spent time as in the elementary school classroom teaching literacy. So excited to be here with you today and to be your guide for unboxing the new adult education standards frameworks. So we are going to follow a simple flow here. We first want to help you understand the background and development of the new standards, a little bit of the why and the how, so you understand the process a bit. We also want to make sure that you're clear on the structure of the new standards. There are going to be some ways that the standards are structured differently. And we want to make sure that that's clear for you, so that's not a barrier to you being able to access the content. And the last thing is we really want to spend some time sort of at that 10,000 foot view, helping you understand some of the underlying principles that undergird the design of the standards, so that you're walking away with some sticky messages and some headlines to take back to your programs with you. I'm going to turn it over to Shira to talk a little bit about the background.
Great, thanks, Molly, and thanks for the introduction, June and Molly. So as Molly said, my name is Shira, and I'm going to talk a little bit about the background for why we have these new standards. So as some of you may know, back in 2019, Florida Executive Order 1932 was issued and essentially led to a revision of the state standards for math and ELA in grades K to 12. This new set of standards is called the Benchmarks for Excellent Student Thinking, or commonly called the BEST standards. So to help understand those new BEST standards in relation to the existing adult education standards, a report was commissioned last year in the spring of 2021. So we could better understand, okay, what are the similarities and differences between the existing adult basic education standards and these new math and ELA BEST standards in K to 12. So the report ultimately includes high-level information about those kind of big picture differences between the two standards frameworks. And it also includes a very granular standard by standard analysis of each strand and each standard. The report served as really helpful research and ultimately became a resource that then helped guide the creation of a new set of adult education standards that were better aligned with the K-12 BEST standards. So I'm going to talk for a minute about some of what we surfaced in that report in ELA. So as I mentioned, the report looked at every single ABE standard. And for each ABE standard, there was a best standard or benchmark, that any best standard or benchmark with overlapping content and skills was identified and then analyzed. So the following alignment ratings were used to help clarify the degree of similarity and difference. So a strong alignment meant that there were no substantive differences in terms of the skills or expectations between the ABE standard and the BEST standard. A moderate alignment rating meant that there were 1 to 2 substantive differences between the standards. A weak alignment meant that there were multiple, as in more than 2, substantive differences between the standards. And a rating of none meant that there was no corresponding standard. When we talk about substantive differences, what we mean is less about terminology and more about what would actually have an impact on instruction and assessment. So in ELA, what you can see here is that overall, there was 62.6% strong or moderate alignment between the existing ABE standards and the K-12 BEST standards. So what does that mean? Ultimately, that means that just under 63% of the content and skills between the two standards frameworks overlaps. I'm going to pass it back to Molly in just a minute, but I want to highlight that the findings from this report then really served as the starting point for thinking about which content and skills to prioritize in any new or revised set of adult basic education standards.
Great. And so here is sort of the comparable analysis on the math side. You'll notice it looks a little bit different, but it's really important to highlight that similar research and a similar process was followed analyzing and surfacing the key similarities and differences between the BEST K-12 standards framework and the previous ABE mathematics framework. You'll see that the alignment is overall a little bit less strong on the math side, with only about 50% of the standards being rated as having strong or moderate alignments. But again, what this really helped us was lay the groundwork and the foundation for the development of the revised ABE standards framework that we're going to be sharing with you today, by really helping us hone in and narrow in on the key skills and the key content that was most important to draw attention to in the design and the development of the new standards.
So the decision was made ultimately to revise the ABE standards, right, and create a new set of standards that better aligned to the K-12 BEST standards. And so began a process of developing these standards last fall and winter. So we convened a working group of educators and administrators from adult education and post-secondary programs across the state of Florida. And those working group members came together and we collaborated to develop this set of standards. So we had our first kickoff meeting on October 19th, and then we launched into an iterative input and feedback cycle for November and December. We then met, that was asynchronous. We then met again in mid-December to work out any remaining input and feedback and resolve any kind of outstanding questions. Bloomboard then took that remaining feedback and integrated it and revised, did the final revisions to then ultimately be able to submit the draft standards to the State Board of Education for approval in mid-February. So a huge shout out to the folks in the working group who really worked together to provide incredibly valuable input that really made this a strong set of academic standards.
Great. So a little bit more of the nuts and bolts of the development process. We think it's helpful before we dig into the standards themselves to understand 3 guiding principles that we used and applied throughout the development process. So, essentially we had a strong version of adult basic education standards to start with. And we didn't want to lose all of the work that went in to the development of your previous standards framework. To say a little bit more about that, really the previous standards framework represents kind of the core of the core, right? Groups of industry leaders, post-secondary program leaders, national experts got together to take the previous K-12 standards framework and distill it into the core of the core, right? And that work is what resulted in your current standards framework. But we also know that there's a lot of smart thinking that went into the development of the new K-12 best standards framework. And we didn't want to lose that. We really wanted to make sure to bring that in and integrate that so that we're putting forward a product that is preserving what was strong about your existing framework while also bringing forward some of the improvements that are the hallmark of the K-12 best. Additionally, we really wanted to be careful and thoughtful and optimize the alignment to your current assessment system. So with those sort of tensions in mind, we held ourselves to these 3 guiding principles. So the first one is we adopted the organization and terminology of the K-12 best standards. And that's part of the reason why we're spending a lot of time talking about structure with you today, because the structure will feel different. And that is as a result of this guiding principle. We have adopted the organization and terminology of K-12 best. And in part, the reason for that is really it actually offers an opportunity for streamlined and more coherent standards frameworks. We'll talk a little bit more about that in a few. The second principle was, sometimes there were standards, or there was content rather, that appeared in a different level in best than it did in ABE. In those instances, what we ended up doing was keeping that content at the same level as where it appeared in the previous ABE standards framework. And again, the thinking here was to minimize any impact on the alignment between the new standards and the current assessment system. The last principle, it really is born out of the fact that when we're looking at K-12 best, we're talking about grade level standards for each grade from kindergarten to 12, right? And the ABE standards framework has just 4 levels, right? 1 through 4. So to a certain extent, you have 2 different frameworks that you sort of have to marry and make fit. And the result was, in some cases, it was very easy to take a couple of grade level standards and combine them together to create the equivalent NRS standard at the appropriate NRS level. I'll show you an example a little bit later of what this looks like in math. But again, the idea was when it was possible to combine standards across grade levels to create a single standard that was an equivalent for the comparable NRS level, that was what we did. So again, really trying to streamline, synthesize, and condense content when it was appropriate, with the needs of the end user, the adult education practitioner, teacher, program leader, front and center in mind.
Great, thanks, Molly. So I'm going to spend the next probably 10 to 12 minutes or so talking you through the structure and underlying principles of the Reasoning Through Language Arts framework, which is the new combined ELA framework. So let's first quickly talk about that new framework structure. So previously, the ABE frameworks included two different documents. There was a reading framework and a language arts framework. There is now only one. The Reasoning Through Language Arts framework includes all of the strands for reading, writing, etc. So when you, a little bit later towards the end of our webinar today, when you have an opportunity to go onto the adult education framework, go into the adult education curriculum frameworks page, you will see that the previous ABE framework documents are still there for reading and language arts. And my understanding is that those will continue to be courses that are offered for the next academic year, 22-23. You will also see the new ABE framework, Reasoning Through Language Arts, which is also being offered instead of those two for the next school year. And then at the end of the next academic year, the previous ABE frameworks will no longer be active, and it will only be the Reasoning Through Language Arts framework. Continuing on to talk about the structure, and consistent with what Molly mentioned around the first design principle and sticking with the structure of the best standards. The previous ABE strands, there were 5: foundations, reading, writing, language, and speaking and listening. What you'll see when you download the new Reasoning Through Language Arts standards framework is that there are 4 strands: foundations, reading, which are pretty similar in structure to the previous ABE, but then where they start to diverge is the communication and vocabulary strands, which look and feel quite a bit different. You will notice that there is no separate speaking and listening strand. The previous ABE framework included this separate strand for speaking and listening, and even though some of the skills in speaking and listening would embed or overlap other pieces of what you might find in the reading and writing standards, it was called out as its own strand because of the importance of developing strong communication and interpersonal skills. The new framework, based on the K-12 BEST standards, does not include the speaking and listening strand. However, there are speaking and listening skills. They are, for the most part, when they appear, are embedded in that communication strand. But generally, one thing you'll notice is that it is the attention to speaking and listening skills overall is a little bit less comprehensive and deep than in the previous ABE standards. Continuing on to talk a little bit more about structure, this is what the standard codes look like. So you'll see in the subject RLA, which stands for Reasoning Through Language Arts, you'll see the NRS level. the strand, which in this case is reading, the standard, which in this case is reading informational text, and then the benchmark, which in this case is central idea. We chose this standard coding, this alphanumeric coding scheme, because it mirrors what you will see if you look into the K-12 best ELA standards. Instead of NRS level, you would see grade level, but otherwise it'll be very comparable, and that was intentional so that you'd be able to see, for those who need to, you'd be able to see ways in which the ABE framework maps to and mirrors the K-12 framework. Something that's a little new and different is that there is a thing, a structure called the Rla Expectations. In K-12, these are called the ELA Expectations. And we pulled those ELA expectations directly over from K-12 Best and into the new adult education frameworks. They are designed very intentionally to be overarching skills that run through every component of language arts instruction. So these are skills that students should be using throughout the strands, and they're intended to be taught in integrated ways. There are 6 Rla expectations in total. I've listed the first one here for you, which is cite evidence to explain and justify reasoning. While there is no precise equivalent in terms of the previous ABE standards, there's no sort of exact one-to-one, you will see that the expectations themselves, the content, for example, in this case, citing evidence, does have some parallels, and there's quite a bit of overlap in terms of the skills. So for example, this RLA expectation number 1 has a fair amount of overlap with, for example, the previous reading anchor standard 1. I want to highlight some of the really important underlying principles of this framework. So there's looking at the individual standards themselves, and there's also really understanding the way, the principles that undergird the framework, right? Like, why is this framework designed the way it is? Why, in what ways are these individual benchmarks building towards these bigger ideas of what students should know and be able to do? So a few that are really important to highlight. This framework emphasizes the importance of students working with grade level complex text, grounding their responses in evidence from the text, building knowledge of the world, developing their research and technology skills. There is a strong prioritization around foundational literacy skills as incredibly important in supporting all learners. There is a really important focus on vocabulary. And lastly, specific to adult education, there is an importance on engaging deeply with informational text. So similar to the previous ABE framework, there is generally, in this case, for adult learners, a deprioritization of the literature and poetry standards, not because they're not objectively important, and they are very much embedded in the K-12 standards. However, the decision was made with the working group to learn from the previous adult education standards and their focus on informational text, to pull that same principle over to make sure that we really spend the time needed when we have these shorter, more condensed and concentrated periods of time with adult learners, that we are setting them up for success by really supporting their ability to navigate complex informational text. A couple of things that might feel a little bit new. So one of the things that'll feel new in the RLA framework is generally you'll see more continuity and clarity in terms of the vertical progressions. And I'll talk about a couple examples in a minute. There's also generally simpler and more concise language. There's fewer instances where there's multiple different skills that are kind of all jumbled into one standard. As I mentioned earlier, there is less emphasis overall on speaking and listening skills. And then there are a few new benchmarks, not a lot, but a few, and I'll call out a couple of them so you know to kind of keep an eye when you dig into the standards framework. So the first one I want to call out is rhetoric. Rhetoric is introduced earlier intentionally in the K-12 framework, and that's based on the stated importance of giving students an opportunity to develop their reasoning and their understanding of argumentative language skills better. And there's also an element there around around civic literacy and being able to navigate civics texts. And in support of all of that, there is this introduction of rhetoric in 6th grade in K-12. And so to, again, map to that, we've brought over that same set of benchmarks to start at level 4 in the adult education framework. A couple of other things you'll notice, there is a handwriting benchmark. Handwriting was embedded before into some language standards. It's now called out as its own unique benchmark. You'll also see more clear vertical progression in both narrative writing and multimedia, which includes levels 1 through 4. Previously, narrative was only in levels 1 and 2, multimedia only in levels 3 and 4. Again, you'll see those nice vertical progressions. And finally, I want to highlight, again, consistent with the principles I listed before, around the importance of foundational literacy. Foundations benchmarks are extending into level 4. So previously, they would end at level 3, which is equivalent to grade 4 and 5. However, the K-12 best standards really wanted to highlight the importance around support for secondary students who are not yet proficient readers. And so, you know, this was a really important part of what the working group grappled with, was what does it look like when we have adult learners coming in with various needs in terms of their foundational literacy skills. And so the decision was made to continue the foundation benchmarks into level 4, which is both important for this adult population and also consistent with what it looks like in the K-12 best standards as well. Okay, that was a lot of digging into the RLA framework. I'm going to pass it to Molly to give you the same understanding around the structure and principles of the new math framework.
Awesome. So yes, we're going to shift gears to math, and sort of depending on maybe your own personal experiences in math class, you know, this may be an exciting shift for you, or it, you know, sometimes you start talking about math and people's stress level goes up a little bit, but hopefully the changes and revisions that I'm going to describe to you today will feel like it, you know, decreases that stress level a little bit. And so we're going to start actually with an exciting shift here. And earlier, remember I mentioned that we adopted the organization and structure of the K-12 best. Well, practically what that means in math is we're shifting from 9 strands. So there used to be sort of these 9 different buckets of math topics that was the organization or the organizational framework for the previous version of ABE. And we're moving to just 6 strands. And really this presents an opportunity to consolidate, to help connect related topics, and to really increase the coherence of the standards framework. And maybe also practically make it a little more user-friendly less unwieldy. And I'd like to talk specifically about algebraic reasoning. That's a place that you see that three strands: operations and algebraic thinking, expressions and equations, and ratios and proportional relationships were sort of all brought together. Those are the hallmarks and the foundations of algebraic thinking. And so you can see how, again, there's a greater opportunity for connections and coherence, opportunities for different related topics to be connected, because those three strands have been brought together into the umbrella strand now called algebraic reasoning. So that's one of the key shifts in the structure of the new ABE standards framework. And similar to sort of the coding conventions and naming conventions that Shira just articulated, you'll see we've adopted something similar for ABE math. So we start with the subject math, NRS level, the strands. Remember, there's just 6 now instead of 9. So in this case, it's NSO, or number, sense, and operations, the standard number, and the benchmark. Okay, so let's talk a little bit more practically about why you only see one standard at NRS level 1, and then you look down to NRS level 4 and you see 3 different ones. Okay, that relates back to that guiding principle that I articulated earlier, of when it's possible to sort of fuse together standards that are at multiple grade levels into a single overarching standard that for a particular NRS level, we took steps to do so. So you can see NRS level 1 is develop an understanding for place value of 2-digit numbers. And what that represents is both the kindergarten and the first grade place value standards. And we sort of brought them together and fused them into a single standard at that level, instead of having 2 very related, distinct standards that represented a different expectation at the kindergarten level and first grade level. And again, I think this helps to streamline and simplify for anyone who's using the standards framework to plan. When we look at NRS level 4, remember that represents grade levels 6, 7, and 8. So we have 3 different grade levels that we're trying to bring together and consolidate the key knowledge and skills at that level. So it's a little bit more challenging in that way, but what in this particular instance, when we looked at the 6th, 7th, and 8th grade NSO number, sense, and operations standards, what we noticed is they're each very unique and distinct. So at the 6th grade level, we were talking about extending knowledge of numbers to negatives. And then by 8th grade, we're talking about solving problems with rational numbers and scientific notation. So instead of trying to fuse those together the way that we did with NRS level 1, we decided to keep those as distinct and to articulate the differences using 1A, 1B, and 1C. And again, we really think that's going to be helpful to any program leader or educator who is trying to plan for the appropriate instruction for their students, because we're really preserving each of those key skills, allowing them each to be called out distinctly rather than trying to fuse them together, so that it's really clear what the key understandings that students need to have at level 4, right? There's really 3 distinct things that students need to know and be able to do: 1A, 1B, and 1C. So hopefully talking through that way and providing the example sort of helped illuminate and clarify that particular guiding principle that I talked about earlier. Okay, So the underlying principles, right? And hopefully this is, if you're a math person, which I'm hoping many of you are, this is music to your ears. But really the prior or the previous version of the ABE, those standards were about helping students and giving students the opportunity to apply math to solve real world problems, helping them make connections between and across grade level standards, and also ensuring that they're not just building procedural fluency, but also conceptual understanding as well. These are all essential elements that were carried over into the new version of the ABE math standards framework, right? And so you'll see these sort of shine through as you read the language of the individual standards. There's lots of opportunities for your students to do these three things. Now, what's different? There are, a few differences here. And again, we spoke about one earlier, which was around the, just practically how the standards are structured, right? And the move from 9 strands to just 6. But there are a couple other differences. One is, the new K-12 BEST standards, they introduced something that's called the mathematical thinking and reasoning standards. And these are really the mathematical habits of mind that students need to be able to develop alongside their understanding of the content. And so these are really, really important as we think about developing students who are proficient in mathematics. And so we carried those over, and you'll see those listed early on in the standards framework document. You'll also notice less of an explicit focus on conceptual understanding in grades 2 and beyond, right? So that it becomes more pronounced really in level 3. So a lot of that sort of new math that many teachers and caregivers found challenging, there's less of an emphasis on that, especially in the levels above level 3. And that has an accompanying shift, which really relates to the introduction of fluency expectations earlier, right? So students are expected to be proficient now with the standard algorithm for long division when they're exiting grade 5, which is really, before they're moving from level 3 to level 4 in ABE. So there's fluency expectations that are introduced earlier and more pronounced throughout the standards framework. So you'll see the word fluency appear quite a bit. And so here are some sort of practical examples. I mentioned long division being moved to level 3, but additionally, by the end of level 2 now, students are expected to master multi-digit addition. So less of a focus on, place value strategies and other things like that, which requires students to draw upon their conceptual understanding, and more of a focus on getting students proficient, comfortable, and increasing their speed and automaticity with key essential mathematical procedures.
All right. So it's your turn. We have created a little scavenger hunt, which is an opportunity for you all to dig into one of the standards frameworks a little bit and start to, if you haven't already, start to orient yourself to some of what we just talked about in terms of the structure and the design principles. So I'm going to give you all a task for the next 10 minutes. We're going to ask you all to navigate to the adult education website, the curriculum frameworks page, which I have pulled up here. So the 22-23 Adult Education Curriculum Frameworks page, and you'll see here, as I mentioned at the beginning, both the language arts and reading ABE standards from your previous standards, as well as the new reasoning through language arts standards, and then the new mathematics standards framework as well. So when you navigate to and download the standards framework document, you can pick either math or RLA, and then follow the 3 steps listed below for each one, either math or RLA. What we would love to have folks do is take 10 minutes and see how many of these 3 questions for whichever subject area you pick, you're able to get through. And as you have some thoughts in response to these questions, we'd love to have you drop them in the chat. That way you all can be, when we come back together, kind of skimming through each other's responses and learning from what each person is noticing and figuring out about the standards framework document. If you have any questions about how to navigate to the curriculum framework or download it, or any other questions, please drop them into the Q&A, and Molly and I will be going in either jotting some responses, or we can also provide some responses orally as you all are working through this. So I'm going to go on mute, and we're going to come back at 3:50. So that's actually 9 minutes. And then we'll share out a few reflections that we're noticing on the chat and then finish up. All right, folks. All right, let's take one more minute to finish whatever you are working on or looking at, and then if you're able to drop a thought or two into the chat. Let's do one more minute. Okay. Thank you so much for engaging in this activity and for digging into the standards and sharing. Those folks who shared some of your discoveries in the chat, that's really helpful. So if you haven't had a chance yet, go look in the chat and see what your fellow colleagues have discovered so far about the standards. I am going to pass it over to June to close us out, but on behalf of me and Molly, I just wanted to say thank you for your time today. Thanks for inviting us to be part of this work with you and in support of you. And we are excited also to come back next week, and June will tell you more, but hopefully we will be able to have some of the same folks back next week to talk about the employability standards.
Thank you so much, Molly and Shira. So if you could just take a few minutes to answer, just 1 minute to answer these 3 short questions, your feedback is really important to us. And as Molly and Shira mentioned, next week we'll be doing part 2 of unboxing the new adult education standards, but we'll be really zoning in on the adult education employability frameworks. So you're not going to want to miss that. So I hope to see all of you next Wednesday. Until then, stay safe and we'll see you soon.